Everyone, my name is Robert Gregory, and I'm the Public Affairs Director with the Australian Jewish Association. This interview is about an important but a controversial topic. Some would prefer we don't talk about it, but here at the AJA, we are committed to revealing the truth, politically correct or not. Listening to mainstream media, one could be forgiven for thinking that there exists some ancient indigenous people called Palestinians who have lived peacefully on their land for thousands of years before being cruelly dispossessed by the Jews. My guest today, Alan Meyer, is a retired educator here in Australia. He takes a keen interest in the Arab-Israeli conflict and he's published several articles as well as running a blog on Arab-Israeli issues. Thank you for joining the AJA today, Alan.
Thanks for inviting me, Robert.
Of course, now I'm going to start with a pretty basic question. When was the Palestinian identity invented?
Yes, there's a popular chant in recent years that states that Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. Free of Jews is the intention. That's to say, Jewish autonomy in Palestine must end and revert to its alleged indigenous population, the nation, state, country of the ancient Palestinians. And in order to achieve that goal, anti-Israel Arab supporters and then non-Arab supporters have championed a range of strategies, such as boycotting Israeli and Jewish lecturers, divesting from Israeli enterprises, sanctioning Israeli produce from what the delegitimizers call the occupied territories, and sanctioning Israel on a standing basis in the UN, as well as in the various reports and commentary from organizations such as Amnesty International, HRW, the EU, and a plethora of non-Israeli government NGOs operating inside and outside of Israel with support of foreign money. In large part, that BDS initiative has failed, but undeterred, anti-Israeli forces focus then shifted to designating Israel an apartheid state, a manifestly inaccurate statement given that 2.1 million Israeli Arab Druze and Christians live in Israel, with Arab Muslim doctors, lawyers, and teachers in Israeli hospitals, courts, and schools, and with the largely hostile Arab coalition party in Israel's parliament, the Knesset. By that same token, there are no Jews in Ramallah, Gaza, Jenin, or al-Fahim. So what about your question about the ancient pre-Abrahamic and Canaanite Palestinian national identity, which Jews of Israel have allegedly trampled on? Well, it's variously claimed by the Arabs of Gaza, Judea, and Samaria that the indigeneity and culture and history in the currently termed occupied territories goes back thousands of years to the times of the Canaanites, over 5,500 years allegedly, and that they thus precede the arrival of Abraham and the Hebrews. In 2016, for example, Mahmoud Abbas, current Prime Minister, President, of the PLO, of the Palestinian Authority, says, our narrative says that we were in this land since before Abraham. I'm not saying it, the Bible says it. The Bible says in these words that the Palestinians existed before Abraham. Well, in fact, the Bible does not say this, nor does recorded history. More than 1,000 years before Muhammad's birth, in the year 570 of the current era, Jews lived in what became effectively Muslim conquest lands. Jerusalem, which came under Muslim rule for the first time in 638 CE, formed the focal point of Jewish life for more than a millennium before the dawn of Islam. Jerusalem had been the Jewish capital for more than 600 years. When it was conquered by the Babylonians, the city also became center of a Jewish kingdom ruled by Jewish kings for 78 years, from 141 to 63 BCE. And before I briefly scope the notion of national identity later on, as it relates to the Arabs who now identify as Palestinians, it's worth noting that the total absence through historical chronicles of credible historians and other commentators of any mention of Palestinians as a polity, an ethnicity, a nation, or a people. To start off, the Quran, Surah 17, 104 says, and thereafter we said to the children of Israel, dwell securely in the promised land, and when the last warning will come to pass, we will gather you together in a mingled crowd. I suppose what I'm saying is one can safely assume that if the ancient Palestinians, per revisionist history, had indeed existed as a people, nation, or any type of entity, the Quran would not have failed to mention them as inheritors of the land. But the Quran does not ever mention Palestinians even once, nor do the Roman records at the time of the destruction Second Temple. The Romans were bent on getting rid of the Jewish connection to Judea, not a Palestinian one, and renamed Judea, Syria Palestina, and Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina. Clearly, they did not rename Judea Palestina in a nod to either Arab or Muslim Palestinians. And some 200 years after the start of the Muslim-Arab invasions of the largely Jewish Levant, the Arab writer Muqdashi complained that in Jerusalem, the large majority of the population were Jewish and said that the mosque is empty of worshippers. Again, no mention of ancient or indigenous Palestinians. 1377, Ibn Khaldun, arguably one of the most creditable Arab historians of his era, wrote, Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel extended over 1400 years. It was the Jews who implanted the culture and customs of the permanent settlement. And this was sort of echoed by comments from Christian travelers and pilgrims concerning the Arabs in Palestine in the 1800s. And they said the Arabs themselves cannot be considered but temporary residents. Well, that's no longer true. They pitched their tents in its grazing fields or built their place of refuge in its ruined cities. They created nothing in it. In 1937, Auni Bey Abdul Hadi, Syrian Arab leader to British Peel Commission, said, there's no such country as Palestine. Palestine is a term invented by the Zionists. There's no Palestine in the Bible. Well, that's true. Our country was for centuries part of Syria. Palestine is alien to us. It is the Zionists who introduced it. And in fact, he's right, as witnessed by the Palestine Post, the Palestine Electric Company, the Palestine Symphony Orchestra, the United Palestine Appeal, the Anglo-Palestine Bank, and even the National Palestinian Football Team of the era were all Jewish organizations. It never referred to Arabs, and nor was the nomenclature ever even desired by them. As late as in August 1947, 3 months before the passing of the UN resolution, partitioning mandate Palestine into Arab and Jewish states, Al-Wahda, the HSC's mouthpiece, advocated the incorporation of Palestine and Transjordan at the time into Greater Syria. No mention of the ancient Palestinian people or nation. And even right up to May 1948, before Israel declared independence, there was debate as to whether to call the to-be-inaugurated Jewish state Philistine, Zion, or Israel. And it was only after the name Israel was chosen that the Arabs under Arafat co-opted the name they had previously so intensely disliked. On a side note of interest, in 1945, the Arabs boycotted Palestinian goods in an action against Jewish industry, hardly a boycott of fellow Arabs per their late adoption of the Palestinian moniker. And as Professor Philip Hitti, Arab historian, said in 1946, there's no such thing as Palestine in history. Absolutely not. In 1956, the representative of the Saudi Arabia at the United Nations said it's common knowledge that Palestine is nothing but southern Syria. PLO military commander and member of the PLO executive, Zoher Mohsen, I think he said in 1977, there are no differences between Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese. We're all part of one nation. It's only for political reasons that we carefully underline our Palestinian identity. The founding of a Palestinian state is only tactical and a new tool in the continuing battle against Israel. But even later than that, the Syrian dictator Hafiz Assad, father to the current dictator in Syria, told the PLO leader Yasser Arafat, there's no such thing as a Palestinian people, no Palestinian entity, there's only Syria. You are an integral part of the Syrian people. Palestine is an integral part of Syria. Therefore, it is we, the Syrian authorities, who are the true representatives of the Palestinian people. And so, when did the world first hear of a Palestinian people, you might ask? A people putatively fabled in antiquity going back to pre-Canaanite times? Well, the answer is that the world first heard of the term Palestinians in May 1964 at the first Arab League summit in Cairo. The League had convened to develop ways to destroy the state of Israel post their 1948 loss on the battlefield. And the formation of the Palestine Liberation Organization in May 1964 was the tool and umbrella organization used to organize disparate Arab paramilitary groups in and around the new state of Israel for that purpose. Initially, the PLO's legislation, the Palestine National Council, did little to further the interests of the new nation of Palestinians. These interests started with the elimination of the state of Israel per Article 1 of their charter. Specifically, Article 1 stated that Palestine is the homeland of the Arab Palestinian people. It is an indivisible part of the Arab homeland, and the Palestinian people are an integral part of the Arab nation, the wider Ummah. In fact, Article 2 states Palestine, with the boundaries it had during the British Mandate, is an indivisible territorial unit. Well, that leads to some sort of a lexical problem, a lexical sleight of hand, if you will, because if Palestine during the British Mandate was indivisible, then Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan have no right to exist. So, to sum up, the term Palestinian people as a descriptive of Arabs in Palestine appeared for the first time in the preamble of the 1964 PLO Charter drafted in Moscow and affirmed by the first 422 members of the Palestine National Council, who had been handpicked by the KGB. So why Moscow, you ask? Well, at the time, the Soviets were in the business of creating and supporting liberation organizations for Palestine and Bolivia in 1964, Colombia in 1965, and in the 70s, the Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia that bombed US airline offices in Europe, and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine that bombed Israelis. But the PLO was by far its most enduring success. But interestingly, at that same summit in 1964, Article 24 of the same charter stated that the PLO did not exercise any territorial sovereignty, and that's important, over the West Bank or Gaza, only the land controlled by Israel at that time. This was because Jordan and Egypt, Muslim Arab states both, had illegally occupied Judea and Gaza. Thus, the inhabitants of the general Palestinian area, Mandate Palestine, were never subjects of a legally recognized sovereign Arab nation, but of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which ruled the area for 400 years. On the other hand, though, true that today there is a concept of Palestinian identity and nationalism, which has emerged and become a political factor. But possibly the single most important factor leading to the idea and development of a Palestinian national identity was the creation of Israel and the Arab defeat by Israel in 48-49. That's to say, Palestinian national identity is defined more perhaps by its opposition to Zionism and not its national aspirations for Palestinian Arabs. In many ways, that Palestinian national identity even copied the Zionist model from use of words like diaspora, the right of return, indigenous inhabitants, and moved on to co-opting the Jew Jesus as a Palestinian and Jewish patriarch Abraham as a Muslim prophet. Similar to what Islam earlier took as a religion took from Judaism, which is monotheism, gender-based prayer segregation, rite of circumcision, praying 3 times a day, well, 5 in Islam, initially praying to Earth Jerusalem, and of course, Jewish dietary laws, which are very similar. And that's about it.
Thank you for that historical context. It's amazing that it's not more widely known, but yeah, everything you said is so true and so relevant to the conflict today. And I want to ask you, Would anyone have called themselves a Palestinian 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago?
Oh, yeah, certainly. Perhaps not 1,000 years ago, but certainly 100 years ago. It was the Jews who called themselves Palestinians. As mentioned earlier, the Palestine Post, Electric Company, Palestine Symphony, Bank, the Anglo-Palestine Bank, and even the National Palestinian Football Team, they were all Jewish enterprises. The Arabs detested the term Palestinian as applied to them. The currency of the time was minted in Britain and stamped Eretz Israel in English, Hebrew, Arabic. This because the Arabs always considered themselves South Syrian, and the reference to Arabs, even in Mandate times, as late as Mandate times, before Israel was declared independent, was always as a descriptive noun, as in Palestinian Arab. If we get onto national identity, typically they have three key elements: sovereignty, self-determination, and self-sufficiency. Putative Palestinians have never had this, and they still don't have it. But a national identity and a concept of a people of themselves is also about discrete language, religion, and culture. A Palestinian national identity should arguably include some sense of a nation as a cohesive whole, as represented by distinctive traditions, religion, culture, and language. The facts are that the Palestinians have never had a discrete identity, and in their own words, by their own leaders, have followed the same religion, language, culture, and of the other surrounding Arab Muslim states, and identified as Syrian Arabs, unlike Jews who had a discrete religion, culture, and language unbroken in the occupied southern Levant for over 3,000 years. For example, when the Islamic armies conquered the Levant, they adopted the administrative name used by the Byzantines and dubbed part of Palestina Prima, the first Palestine, more or less today's Jerusalem area and the Shfela, the coastal plain, as Jund Filastin. Jund means army, and Jund Filastin means the Palestine military command. In other words, the name did not signify the national identity of a Palestinian people who lived in the land, but instead a military district in line with Byzantine nomenclature. So the term Palestinian did not take on its current popular meaning until the mid-20th century and was used as a regional reference. And even then, for example, in 1948, the five-army Arab invasion of the nascent Jewish state was more an attempted imperialist Muslim scramble for Mandate Palestine territory, not Palestinian Arab national identity. And had this succeeded, as the first secretary of the General Arab League, Abdul Rahman Azam, admitted to a British reporter, Transjordan was to swallow up the central hill regions of Palestine with access to the Mediterranean and Gaza. The Egyptians would get the Negev. The Galilee would go to Syria, except that the coastal part, as far as Akko, would be added to Lebanon. Had Israel lost the war, its territory would have been divided among the invading Arab forces. No Palestinian national identity there, and the name Palestine would arguably have vanished into the dustbin of history.
So where did the Arabs living in the land of Israel descend from then?
Well, good question. For today's Gazan and Judean Arabs to claim an ethnic Palestinian identity is questionable when one considers that through centuries of Muslim imperialism, right down to the end of the Ottoman Empire, in 1918, caliphs and other rulers brought in hundreds of thousands of soldier slaves loyal to their paymasters. The Tulunides, for example, brought in Turks and Negroes. The Fatimids introduced Berbers, Slavs, Greeks, Kurds, and mercenaries of all kinds. Mamelukes imported legions of Georgians and Circassians. Salahuddin brought in 150,000 Persians who were given lands in Galilee and the Sidon district for their services. In the 14th century, 18,000 Urarti Tatars from the Euphrates were brought in, soon followed by 20,000 Ashiris and 4,000 Mongols, who occupied the Jordan Valley and settled from Jerusalem southwards. Around 1830, as a further example, Mehmet Ali colonized Jaffa and Nablus, that's Jewish Shem before the Arab invasion occupation, with Egyptian soldiers and Sudanese allies. So much so that British estimates of the time of the 13,000 inhabitants of Jaffa, for example, run at 8,000 Turco-Egyptians, 4,000 Greeks and Armenians, and 1,000 Maronites. The British did not consider that there were any Arabs at all in that city. And of course, coming into more modern history, thousands more came in the late 19th century following close Jewish settlement of the land because of the better wages and conditions of the flourishing Jewish enterprise. It's true that many Arabs have lived in Israel for generations, but not as a discrete group of ethnic Palestinians. They're descendants of Muslim Arab invasion circa 700 Christian era, some 1700 years after Jews had settled the area, practiced monotheism, enshrined Jerusalem as its religious and cultural capital and cultural core. And this was before Islam was created. And there is a difference between settlement of the land and indigeneity. And Arabs, now preferring to be called Palestinians, are certainly not indigenous to the land. For example, today's family names, excuse me, of many Palestinians attest to their non-Palestinian origins, just as Jews bear names like Berliner, Varsha, Toledano. Arab names in the disputed territories are replete with families named El Masri, Egyptian, Halabi, Syrian, Mughrabi, North African, Baghdadi, Iraqi, Farsi, Iranian, and Hijazi, Saudi Arabian.
So, I mean, with that in mind, why do you think that a Palestinian identity has been invented?
Well, as I noted earlier, Palestinianism developed not as a national emancipatory movement, but as a political foil to Zionism, an attempt to prevent through violence the establishment of a Jewish homeland and rejection of any form of autonomous Jewish political power. I mean, Arab representative government was never established in Palestine, either in 48 or during the next 19 years of Arab rule, because other Arabs co-opted the Palestinian cause, so per se, as a rallying point that would advance the concept that the territory was up for grabs. But one has to listen to the Palestinian representatives themselves on what is a Palestinian. Ahmed Shukeri, a Palestinian spokesman, told the United Nations Security Council in '56 that Palestine was nothing more than southern Syria. And as I've said before, the head of the military operations of the Palestine Liberation Organization said, "Only for political reasons do we carefully underline our Palestinian identity. The existence of a separate Palestinian identity is there for tactical reasons." But that was 1977. As late as 1996, Azmi Bishara, Arab Party member at the time of parliament in Israel's Knesset, stated in response to a question about Palestinian nationality, said, "Well, I don't think there's a Palestinian nation at all. I think there's an Arab nation. I always thought so, and I have not changed my mind." And so today, what continues to hold Palestinians together is a carefully nurtured hatred of Israel and rejection of indigenous Jewish indigenous nationhood, and a delegitimization of Jewish identity in recorded history, as witnessed by Palestinian claims of Jerusalem, the Western Wall, the inability of Jews to pray on the Temple Mount, and the ongoing violence in UNRWA school texts in pursuit of those attempts to diminish Jewish connection to a history recorded in 3 religious texts, 2 of which make up almost 75% of the world's religious followers by populace. In essence, a certain ethno-religious supremacism in the absence of recorded legacy or any recorded history or commentary arguably necessitated the invention of indigeneity on the part of the Palestinians, dating back to, in their words, the Canaanites and Jebusites, and was popularized by Arafat in the 60s to paint Jews as intruders, colonizers, when records of history are filled with facts to the contrary. And while this Palestinian Arab propaganda quest for legitimacy can be understood because of its historical absence. It certainly doesn't make it a fact. So much so that there was never a separate political entity among the Arabs, indicating an Arab group known as Palestinians until 1967. And this political group was not recognized by even other Arab countries until the Rabat Summit Conference in 1974. It might appear that 21 Arab states are not enough and one Jewish state is one too many. Palestinianism flourishes in the Muslim world, Western liberal left, and amongst many less than knowledgeable supporters of that premise, despite there being not a single reference in the peer-reviewed biblical or secular literature to a Palestinian people, nor of the connection of such a people to the Canaanites or any of the other tribes in the area. In the Arab view, the Arabs of Palestine, which was geographically part of Syria, belonged to the Syrian branch of the Arab family of nations, the wider Ummah. And all their culture and tradition linked them to the other Arab peoples. There was never a discrete or recognized Palestinian per se ethnicity, nation, or people. And so the tactic of the myth of a Palestinian people is simple and sophisticated by disseminating and dispersing, well, effectively, untruths and distortions of reality. And history proves that the bigger the lie and the more common its reiteration, the more it is accepted as authentic and genuine. In the 1940s, for example, a certain well-documented Western European country applied just that principle.
So is it true that even the Hamas, the terrorist organization, has rejected the creation of a separate Palestinian state?
Well, that's an interesting question, essentially because Hamas is an internationally proscribed terrorist entity. It rules Gaza in the West, but not Ramallah. Thus, it can never accept or reject any internationally legalized putative Palestinian state now or in the future. What is true, though, is that the PLO, in its various iterations since 1964, has rejected the creation of a Palestinian state. Well, on two occasions, 2000, 2008, while the Arab League, on behalf of themselves, rejected the creation of an Arab Muslim state in addition to Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon, when Israel declared independence in May 1948. For example, what was on offer and what was rejected goes like this. In 2000, the then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak offered to withdraw from 97% of the West Bank and 100% of the Gaza Strip. In addition, he agreed to dismantle 63 isolated settlements. And in exchange for 3% of the annexation of the West Bank, Israel would increase the size of the Gaza territory by roughly a third. But he went further and he made the previously unthinkable concession on Jerusalem, agreeing that Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem would become the capital of the new state. The Palestinians would maintain control over their holy places and have religious sovereignty over the Temple Mount. And the proposal also guaranteed Palestinian refugees the right of return to the Palestinian state and reparations from a $30 billion international fund that would be collected to compensate them. Yasser Arafat refused the offer. But in 2008, then former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert proposed a withdrawal from what Olmert termed Arab Jerusalem. He had an in-principle acceptance of returning to the 1967 demarcation lines, the Green Line, the return of Arab refugees on a case-by-case basis, land swaps with the PA would give them 94% of the state and territory they always said they wanted. But just like his previous boss, Arafat, Abbas walked away from this deal as well. And so the Arabs who now identify as Palestinians were no victims of injustice or colonization, looking to build a state stolen by intruders. They were Arab negotiators looking to delegitimize and remove the core of a Jewish one. And some of the reasons why they've refused this, I expand on one of my later blog posts on the web.
Okay, and I mean, with all this in mind, now that we have all this knowledge, what strategy should pro-Israel advocates like the AJA and others, what should we adopt to respond to these falsifications of history? And related to that, what got you involved in this issue? What's your interest?
Yeah, well, with the near demise of print media as a primary means of mass communication, the proliferation of electronic media and myriad political fora have enabled a mass of opinions masquerading as fact on every single issue imaginable, and particularly in hot potato political ones such as the Arab-Israeli conflict. For my part, on the Arab-Israeli conflict, I saw that increasing numbers of claims, ranging from the inaccurate to the downright salacious, were being generated by various bad faith actors and groups in a surge of unchecked revisionist narratives of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And this was a problem, or actually still is a problem, because Israeli and Jewish counter-propaganda was non-existent to any discernible degree. My interest in this area was to try and redress, in a very modest way, some of that revisionism through a blog of mine, where the guiding principle was verifiable fact and quote, and not interest-based opinion. And it is something like that that other contributing parties and interested parties like the AJA need to engage in, counter inaccuracy and lie with fact reference, because saying the lie will travel halfway around the world before the truth even gets out of bed has never been more true. And particularly in the last week, this is demonstrated in the latest round of violence from the PIJ, the Jihad Islami, in Gaza this month, where the PIJ propaganda blamed Israel for the deaths of 5 children in the latest flare-up. But for once, Israeli authorities were on the ball and proved unequivocally that there was no Israeli military activity at the time of the reported deaths, and that the civilian deaths were actually a result of yet another PIJ rocket falling within Gaza. You asked what my personal interest is. My interest in this area is basically pursuit of truth and a dislike of interest-based opinion and bias, which all too often descends into blatant anti-Semitism. I'm not fond of injustice, wherever it be found, in the Ukraine, Tibet, Taiwan, Uyghurs, the Bosnians, and the Arab-Israeli conflict is closest to my heart, even as alliances change, political relationships become more complex, and at least at the moment, so societies become more conflicted and polarized. I think I'll see an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict in my lifetime, nor will it likely happen in the lifetime of my children, but in the end it will happen. This because people the world over want essentially the same simple things: physical security, right to work, and to foster family and friends. Winds of change, though, are blowing, albeit variably, but at least one thing is certain: violent, no compromise intransigence on the part of the putative Palestinian Arabs has brought them no gain over the past 55 years, since the Six-Day War of 1967. And Palestinianism, which has swallowed billions of accountability-free dollars over this period, has cloyed on increasing numbers of Muslim and Arab supporter states. Well, perhaps in the next 55 years, the penny will drop on a more pragmatic and younger Palestinian leadership, which is determined to drag its followers into a 21st century cycle of prosperity and peace in the future, rather than repeating the unsuccessful violence of its past.
Oh, it's a hopeful message, and just want to really thank you so much for your time today, Alan. We really appreciate it here. And what's the best way for our members to keep up to date with the work you're doing?
I have a blog called salveveritas.wordpress.com, where I post articles of related interest. And so if people would like to have a look at that, they're very welcome.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you again for joining us, and I'm sure we'll see many good things from you in the future. So thank you for that.
Thank you for having me.